huge story that we want to dive into here on the show. The Liberal government, it's being accused of fighting Indigenous people in court. So lawyers are arguing that Canada caused harm by unnecessarily taking children from their families and is trying to avoid paying for it. The government is challenging human rights tribunal rulings that award $40,000 to each child and their parent or grandparent due to discriminatory policy. So there's a lawyer now for the federal government who says compensation in this case is too broad and too sweeping. The optics seem awful, Candy, but are you disappointed by the government's actions in these cases?
Yeah, I continually am disappointed. You cannot come to the table with us and say that you're in a spirit of reconciliation while at the same time you're submitting briefs in courts and tribunals that speak against the very things we're trying to reconcile. You know, even if you just look at the cost of going to court, if you took the money the government has spent to fight children in court, you could put water in every single First Nation in Canada. The problem would be solved like that if they would choose to spend that money that way. The other thing is, on the lead up to our Prime Minister's first election, he spoke a big game about First Nations reconciliation. And as a lifelong NDPer, I voted for Justin Trudeau in that election. And I feel personally affronted by the fact that he is just not doing what he said he was going to do. And, you know, in my experience as a civil servant, I remember even on a provincial level, seeing the government and First Nations trying to negotiate on a specific right, while at the same time, their prosecutors are arguing against that very right in court. And if you go back, 20 years to when UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, was passed, 144 nations voted yes for this international bill. 4 voted against. Canada was one of them. Now, we eventually came to the table, but imagine what it feels like for us when you talk about truth and reconciliation and your country is voting against those kinds of international movements.
Yeah, and the way they're voting against it, I mean, in some of the reports, it feels like nickel and diming trauma. They're talking about $40,000. And they're getting real nitty gritty with $40,000 for someone who spent years in a residential school. Is it the same as if they were only there during the week or they spent a week there? And is it up to is it up to anybody to decide what the value of 1 week of trauma versus however many years is? It's trauma. And so the added grossness to this is, the detailing and nitpicking of what the $40,000 should represent. It's a really, really bad look. But I also appreciate your comments about the Prime Minister and his government, Candy, for sure, and they hold a lot of the responsibility. I would also like to, speak to Canadians who many people still don't have a very broad understanding of this program, this horrible program and this history. And if they do have an understanding of it, there's a misconception that it did happen decades and decades ago. But the thing is that, we hear that date, 1996, is the year that the last residential school closed. And that's quite recent. And to bring it home even further, I'm going to be interviewing someone this week. His name's Joe Buffalo. He is a legendary skateboarder in Canada. He's younger than me, 43 years old. And, when I think about the fact that he was taken from his home at the age of 11, so I would have been about 15. And at 15, I wasn't worried about being taken from my home. I was worried about my driver's license. I wanted to get my driver's license. And I was worried about the drama going on at school, a regular school, not a residential school. And so I think that it drove home for me personally as a Canadian that my generation, all of us here, that's how recent it was. And so for the government to be let's nickel and dime on these $40,000. Let's push back. Let's continue to thwart. Let's continue to obfuscate. It is really layers upon layers of more trauma on a people that have already had the grace to withstand all this trauma already and are actually trying to operate in the spirit of reconciliation.
And I just want to jump in
No, for
again for
sure.
a second on that. The Canadian people worry about the money, but if you could actually see the money that your government wastes in constantly fighting this in court when the decision has already been made. Today I think about the fact that it's National Indigenous Day. It's my great niece's 15th birthday, Sarah. I think about her little sister Hannah, and the Indigenous children all across this country. I do not want to leave this mess for them. I want to go to my grave knowing that we solved this, or at least came closer to solving it.
I agree with all the points that have been mentioned thus far, and I really don't think the Canadian government has a leg to stand on. It is time for Canada to stand up, be accountable, and own up to the atrocities it has committed to the Indigenous community, to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. There is no denying the gruesome discovery that was made in BC, and which is confirmation for those who identify as Indigenous. And so for them to now turn around and say, and truly put a spin on it. This is a PR game at this point. They're putting a spin on the fact, well, no, we believe they should be compensated. We just don't think that this tribunal in particular should be acting as though they have the right to award people this money over a civil action lawsuit. So if you do believe that they should be compensated, what are we fighting about? Why are we going against these people who have gone through generational trauma and are experiencing what is now feeling like a generational curse? This is going through not just from the 60 Scoop survivors, those who were taken from their families and placed in residential schools. This actually is impacting their children, their grandchildren, and everyone that comes after them.
I mean, listen, it continues. That's the thing that is so sad. There's these court cases, which are, again, the optics are awful, but the trauma continues. The residential school system, as we once knew it, may be over, but there is still a horrific funding gap in education on reservations today. There could be a kid on reserve that gets about $6,800 a year from the federal government for funding, and a kid on the other side of a certain line gets $11,000 a year. There's about a 30% funding gap that currently exists in the education system today for Indigenous children versus non-Indigenous publicly funded education. So the trauma for me, that's the part where you were talking about the waters, just the water crisis that is on reservations. There's basics that still have to also be addressed outside of this egregious court cases. So until the federal government can sort of sort out that the trauma wasn't just then either, that the trauma continues today, as Canadians, to your point, Lainey, this is where you must go to your MP and demand change on all fronts, not from just past trauma, but trauma that continues today. I don't think there's change otherwise.
I couldn't agree more. I am constantly telling people we only make up 7% of the population. It does not matter how loud we scream, how hard we protest. The government will not respond to us the way they would if the rest of the population stood with us on this. If all their voting base was pushing, then you would see some change at the government level, because we all say the government has done this, the government is doing that. We are the people. The government represents us. This is all individuals who we vote for, who we support. Some of us work in that area. We all have to take our responsibility in what is happening. We look back at things like Cheney Wenjack dying on the tracks. We look back at residential school and we say, oh, look at how horrible those people were to have that happen. Where right now, today, those kids that didn't die on the track, that lived, they're sleeping on the heat grates downtown, and we step over them when we're on our way to get our coffee. So we are doing our part in not paying attention to what's happening currently. And on this National Indigenous Day, my dream for Canada, for not just the kids, but for the entire country, is that we find a way to come to peace and reconciliation on this and do what we agreed to do.